Thanks to all of the organizers at Socialist Action. It's really nice to be with everyone. I'm speaking to you tonight from Waterloo, Ontario, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the neutral peoples of the Grand River. Before I launch into my presentation, I would like to make a plug for Eve's latest book called Standing on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. I think it's excellent and really important. I read it this summer, and I also brought a copy up to the public library in Cold Lake, where Canada's largest, busiest Air Force base is this past very recently, because I think everyone should read this book. So I'm going to show some slides, and I'm going to talk about war making, the media, and the Canadian state. I'm also going to talk about some statistics showing how Canada is definitely not a peacemaking country. And then I'm going to tell you about Canada at the UN and ways that you can get involved and take action. So I'm just going to share my slides with you now. Okay, so not only is Canada not a peacemaking country, the federal government is colluding with the mainstream media, in particular the CBC, on war making. So I created this graphic in January as the rhetoric for war in Ukraine was ramping up, and I was very concerned about a potential war. Following very closely CBC, and they were making the case to the public for war. So I have this graphic here, CBC, mouthpiece of the militarized Canadian state. And in January, I filed a formal complaint to CBC for not fully and honestly reporting about the conflict in Ukraine, and in particular, talking about NATO's role. Myself and many other peace activists across Canada, we worked very hard to try to get Canada to de-escalate before Russia's invasion on February 24th, to not send weapons, to negotiate and not go to war. But that's not what Canada did. So this was in January, and I'm seeing now the exact same things underway with these protests that we're seeing in Iran. So I want to just bring the latest news to your attention. So 3 days ago, the CBC had a Iranian a woman talk about the protests that were taking place in Iran that arose from the death of Mahsa Amini. And the speaker that they had on the Rosemary Barton show is Mahsa Ahmadinejad. And the CBC, is interviewing her. She is, a well-known, a human rights activist for women's rights in Iran. She founded a campaign called My Stealthy Freedom and this White Wednesday movement for women's rights in Iran. But the thing that the CBC didn't say is about her links to the US government and to the National Endowment for Democracy. So Mahsa Ahmadinejad is being funded to the tune of about 100,000 US dollars a year from the US state, the US State Department. And you can see this if you go to usspending.gov. This is an open public database where you can do a search to find out how the US government is funding various institutes and individuals. And you can see for the past few years, Mahsa Ahmadinejad has been receiving a tremendous amount of money from the US government. And this is a picture of Masih and the former U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who, of course, before taking that role, was the CIA director. And in a speech that he gave in Texas, in his role as the CIA director, said, you know, we at the CIA, we lie, cheat, and steal. So there he is with Masih. So the CBC never conveyed to the Canadian public that she is, you know, working with the U.S. Government in these protests in Iran. And then the year before her meeting with Mike Pompeo, she was a keynote speaker for an event with the National Endowment for Democracy. And of course, the NED was established by the CIA to project, you know, US soft power in the 1980s. And you can see from their website about this event with Masih on, you know, Iranian calls for democracy, that Erwin Kotler, former liberal minister who's now a leader of, who founded the Raoul Wallenbeck Center for Human Rights, and it's based in Quebec, was part of this event. And Kotler right now is been pushing this campaign against Iran. Again, something, you know, these connections, these links are something that the CBC is not telling Canadians about. And then I want to bring to your attention that the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, is headed by a fellow named Damon Wilson. He's the CEO and the president, but before he was one of the vice presidents for European affairs with the Atlantic Council. He was also a deputy director in NATO. And you can see in his bio that he pushed the campaign for NATO enlargement. So all of these connections, all of this backstory is kept from the Canadian public. So the coverage right now on Iran by the CBC is very circumspect. It's being played out right now in the same way as we saw with Ukraine. So the NED has funded a lot of Ukrainian civil society organizations. And one of the organizations that just won the Nobel Peace Prize is the Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties. And the NED has funded this organization, you know, over many years for democracy promotion in the country. And if you do a little bit of searching on the internet, you'll find that this center that has just won the Nobel Peace Prize has actually been calling for more weapons to Ukraine. So, I mean, it just really puts the Nobel Peace Prize in disrepute. Of course, it was when Obama and Kissinger won the prize, but this recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize is not an organization to laud at all. And in fact, the NED took down from its website the 80 pages of grants to Ukrainian civil society that it has been funding for the past 15 years from its website. I have a copy of it. It's also at the Consortium News website. And as Yves was talking about in his remarks about current affairs, what our Minister of Foreign Affairs is doing in Europe and in South Korea, and what our defense minister is doing right now in Europe, making an announcement for a new package of military aid to Ukraine. So Canada has spent, almost $700 million on missiles, on weapons, on ammunition, on other kind of military aid to Ukraine, on top of financial contribution to the Ukrainian government. And there's been no oversight of these weapons transfers or this funding, no oversight at all. And it's really important to remember that not once has the Canadian government called for a ceasefire or negotiations. It's only been giving more and more weapons to Ukraine, prolonging the suffering and the war in Ukraine. It's just really terrible. So earlier this year in the spring, at the time of the federal budget, our defense minister as well announced increased spending to the Canadian military to try to reach NATO's 2% GDP target. So she announced an additional $8 billion to the military, and this is for NORAD modernization and for the purchase of new weapon systems. So let's have a look now at some statistics and look at more closely at Canadian military spending. So this is from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's latest report. It's a ranking of military spending, and you can see the United States at the top at $801 billion. This is for the year prior, 2021. And then if you scroll your finger down and you can see Russia is at $65 billion, so less than a tenth what the United States spends. And if you keep scrolling down, you can find Canada. We're ranked 13th highest in the world for military spending. But when you think about the 30 NATO countries, they are spending a combined $1.1 trillion in military spending. This is, $1.6 trillion in military spending. This is about 65% of global military expenditures just for these 30 member countries of this US-led nuclear-armed military alliance. So it's a tremendous amount of money, and our defense minister said that over the next 5 years, Canada is going to increase even further by another 70% over the next 5 years, which is this critical period where we actually need to spend a lot for the climate crisis. So this graph here is from the latest NATO defense expenditures report that came out in June, and you can see Canada here. In 2014, we spent $20 billion on the military, and now in 2022, you can see military spending is over $35 billion, and like I said, set to increase even higher over the next 5 years. Canada has this image of being a peacekeeping country, but these are the latest statistics from the UN Peacekeeping Office that shows that Canada is currently ranked 71st in the world. For peacekeeping, we have only 54 soldiers wearing the UN blue helmet, despite the fact that Trudeau came into office in 2015 promising that peacekeeping was going to be a priority, and then in 2017 announcing the ELSI initiative to try to increase women in UN peace support operations, but he has failed to fulfill either of these commitments. Canada is very low on peacekeeping. The countries that are at the top for peacekeeping are countries like are the poor developing countries like Bangladesh, Ethiopia, and in fact China is also one of the top contributors, both in personnel and in funding for UN peacekeeping. Another issue that shows that Canada is not prioritizing peacekeeping is our spending for new weapon systems. So in the earlier this year in February, Canada announced that it's going to buy the F-35, which is a highly flawed warplane produced by Lockheed Martin, and it's extremely expensive, extremely carbon intensive, and it's very costly. A life cycle cost is going to be $77 billion. Now, Canada hasn't inked a deal yet with Lockheed Martin for this new contract. There's still time for us to stop it. And next week, we're going to be launching an open letter with Code Pink. They have a new international campaign to cancel the F-35, and we really need your support on this. We need to stop the purchase of these new fighter jets. They're just terrible. they're going to be extremely costly for Canadians, and they're going to prevent us from achieving our Paris Agreement targets. So please help us stop this. We're going to have a rollout of this new campaign to cancel the F-35s next week, and we need you to contact your member of parliament and say no new fighter jets. And then I want to tell you a little bit about Canada at the United Nations. So our ambassador to the UN, Bob Ray, gave an interview with CBC last month, and he, called for the Canadian government to send all of its weapons to Ukraine. So, our top diplomat failed to, call for diplomacy, failed to say we need a ceasefire and negotiations to end this terrible war in Ukraine. This is just, so inappropriate. By contrast, Costa Rica, in the high-level debate that was held last month, just a couple of weeks ago, called for a peaceful resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. It also called for a gradual and sustained reduction in military spending, and it called for a new UN agenda for peace. This is the example that Canada should be following, is the example of Costa Rica. And then I prepared this slide just to show you, compare and contrast Costa Rica, a country for peace, a country that abolished its militaries, not exporting weapons. It has signed and ratified the Treaty on the Prohibition, compared to Canada. And, this is how we're engaged in war making. This is how we're not engaged in peace. And then just to say that, we're continuing, the peace groups in Canada, working on this issue of military spending. We really need to cut military spending and to reallocate it to our urgent social environmental needs. Please press your member of parliament on this. This is a protest that we did outside of Anita Anand's event in Oakville last month. And these are some actions that we did in solidarity with Socialist Action. So I really appreciate folks coming out for this. So this was last week. For Keep Space for Peace Week, we had our signs outside the NATO Association of Canada office and signed letters that we sent to the government. Some more pictures from that protest, and then also in solidarity calling for Julian Assange to be freed and not to be extradited to the United States. And then I just want to tell you quickly in closing that I am heading to Egypt for COP27 and bringing this message of demilitarization for decarbonization and NATO being a climate criminal. I hope from being at home, you will also help amplify our messages. These are the kinds of social media posts we did last year in Glasgow. Please follow us. WILP, I'm on the WILP delegation to COP27 in Egypt, and we'll be rolling out a social media campaign calling for demilitarization for decarbonization, no war, no warming. These are examples of some of our social media showing the rise of military spending by NATO not going to climate finance. And then finally, to let you know, next week is the week of action to stop the war in Ukraine, to stop all the wars, the violence in Palestine. There's events taking place coast to coast. You can find out more if you go to the peaceandjusticenetwork.ca/fund peace not war. That's our hashtag. Please follow us on social media. Please get involved in one of the events. I also want to encourage you to show solidarity with the Black Alliance for Peace. This is their month of action to shut down AFRICOM. And then finally, a resource to share with you, and this connects to what Eve was saying about the statement that that was made recently by our Chief of Defense Staff, Wayne Eyre, saying that China and Russia want war. I encourage you to actually read their joint statement that they made on February 4th, calling for a new era of international relations based on peace and sustainable development. It's really important for you to read this statement. So that's the resource that I would like to share with you, and I'll put that information in the chat. Thanks very much.